Hey guys, today we are doing long division with polynomials. Lucky y'all. Everybody loves long division. Alright, so first of all, before we get into dividing polynomials, we're just going to start with a typical long division problem. So I have 1,573 divided by 13. So I know the first thing I do is I take 13 and I have to figure out, will it go into 15? So 15 divided by 13. I know 13 will go into 15 one time. Then after we did that, I would take this 1 and multiply it by 13. 1 times 13 is 13. From there, we would subtract these two numbers. So 15 minus 13 is a 2. Then after that, we would take this next number and drop it down. Now I have 27. So now I would start the process all over again. I need to figure out how many times will 13 go into 27. So 27 divided by 13. I know 13 goes into 27 twice. So I'm going to take this 2 and multiply it by 13. 2 times 13 is a 26. Then from there we would subtract those two numbers. 27 minus 26 is a 1. And I would drop down that 3. Repeat the process all over again. I'm trying to figure out how many times will 13 go into 13. So 13 divided by 13 is a 1. So now I'll take this 1 and multiply by 13. 1 times 13 is 13. We subtract those two numbers. 13 minus 13 is 0, which means I do not have a remainder. 13 goes into 1,573 121 times perfectly. All right, so what was the steps to that? I know the first thing we did is we divided. After we divided, we multiplied. Step 3 is we subtracted. Step 4, we drop down our next number. And step 5 is when we started to repeat that process all over again. All right, so we're going to be using the same idea, but stepping it up a notch. So same steps, same idea, but let's do this. Okay, so I want to take 6x squared minus 5x plus 1 and divide it by 2x minus 1. So let's go ahead and set that up. All right, guys, math is hard enough as it is. So please, please, please write neatly. Okay, the neater it is, the easier it will be for you to keep it together. Okay, so I need to figure out how many times does 2x go into 6x squared. So really, I'm taking 6x squared and dividing by 2x. I'm going to go ahead and write that out to the side real quick. Well, I know that's equal to 6 divided by 2 is 3. X squared divided by a single x will give me x to the first power because I subtract 2 minus 1 is 1. Okay, so I know when I take 6x squared and I multiply by this first guy of 2x, I get 3x. So recap, I took this piece and I divided it by this first piece out here, this 2x, and I got 3x. Okay, so just like the other problem, I'm going to take this 3x and multiply by what's out front, but this time instead of only having 1, I have two separate things. So first I take 3x and multiply it by 2x, that's going to give me 6x squared. Then I'm going to take this 3x and multiply it by this negative 1. 3x times a negative 1 is a negative 3x. Okay, my next step is to subtract, but see how there's two terms here? So what I do is I always, on the second row, because it's subtraction, I'm going to just make all my signs opposite. So this was a positive, so I'm going to give it a negative sign. This was a negative, so I'm going to turn it into a positive. Okay, that way I can look at my numbers straight up and down. I know a 6 minus 6, those cancel. I know a negative 5 plus a 3 will give me a negative 2, and those are my x's. So I did my subtraction step. Next step is to drop down. So this plus 1 will drop down. This is when the process repeats itself all over again. So I need to figure out how many times will 2x go into negative 2x. So I'm going to take this negative 2x and I'm going to divide by this guy out front. Well, I know the x's cancel, and negative 2 divided by a positive 2 is a negative 1. So I write that on top. So now I'm going to multiply. I'm going to take this negative 1 and multiply by both of these things out front. So first, negative 1 times 2x is a negative 2x. Negative 1 times a negative 1 is a positive 1. Okay, we know our next step is subtraction. So like I said, what I like to do for that is this bottom row, since it's subtraction, I'm just going to change my sign. So this was a negative, I'm going to change it to a positive. This was a positive, I'm going to change it to a negative. That way I can look straight up and down. A negative 2x and a positive 2x cancel. A positive 1 and a negative 1 cancel. So I know I have a remainder of 0, which means that 2x minus 1 goes into this perfectly. My answer is 3x minus 1. Okay, just so you know, it doesn't always divide perfectly, so we will not always have a remainder of 0. So you will see that on this next example. Okay, so I have x squared minus 7x minus 11 divided by x minus 8. So write it neatly and set it up. Okay, step 1, I need to figure out how many times will x go into x squared. So I'm going to take x squared and divide by this guy out here. I know that's going to give me x to the first power because 2 minus 1 gives me a single 1. So I'm going to take my x, put it up here. All right, now I'm going to take this x and multiply by everything out front. I have x times x, that gives me an x squared. I have x times a negative 8, that gives me a negative 8x. All right, for my step of subtraction, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bottom row and make all my signs opposite. This was a positive, so I give it a negative. This was a negative, so I turn it into a positive. And now I can look straight up and down. X squared minus x squared cancels. A negative 7x plus 8x is going to give me a positive 1x. Next step is to drop down. We repeat the process all over again. I want to figure out how many times does x go into 1x. So what I do is I take this 1x and I divide by that guy out front. So my x on top cancels my x on bottom, so that leaves me with a positive 1. So I'm going to put my positive 1 out here. And now we multiply. So I'm going to take this positive 1 and multiply by both of these. So first, 1 times x is a positive 1x. 1 times a negative 8 is a negative 8. All right, so the step for subtraction, remember I changed this the bottom signs. This was a positive, so I give it a negative. This was a minus, so I change it into a plus. A 1 and a negative 1 cancel. A negative 11 plus 8 is a negative 3. And then we drop down. Notice there is nothing to drop down. So what that means is negative 3 is my remainder. Okay, so we won't leave it like that. I'm going to show you how you need to write your remainder. So since it's a negative, up here behind the 1, I'm going to put a minus sign because it was a negative, and I'm going to write a fraction bar. My remainder goes on top, and what I divide by goes on the bottom. So this is how you write a remainder. I put a minus because my remainder was a negative. What you get as your remainder goes on the top, and this guy out front is what you put on the bottom. So my final answer is x plus 1 minus 3 over x minus 8. All right, so we're going to set this one up carefully. Let's be neat. Okay, so I need to figure out how many times does k go into k squared. So to do that, I take this k squared and I divide by this guy out front, which is a k. Well, k squared divided by k is k because 2 minus 1 is a single exponent, right? So k to the first. So I write that at the top. All right, so now I take this guy and I multiply. K times k is k squared. K times a negative 1 is a negative 1k. And now is my subtraction step. So remember, what I do is I just change the signs on the bottom. So this positive k, I'm going to put a negative out front. This minus sign, I'm going to change into a plus sign. So now I can look up and down. A positive k squared and a minus k squared are opposite, so they cancel. A negative 7k plus 1k is going to give me a negative 6k. And then we drop down. This is when we repeat the process all over again. So how many times will k go into negative 6k? So to figure that out, I take negative 6k and I divide by k. My k on top cancels my k on bottom, so that's negative 6. So this negative 6 is what I'm going to go put on top here. Next step is multiply. So I take negative 6 and I multiply by both of these out front. So first, negative 6 times k is a negative 6k. Negative 6 times a negative 1 is a positive 6. All right, so for my step for subtraction, what I do is I take the bottom and I change the sign. This was a negative, so I change it into a positive. This was a positive, so I change it into a negative. A negative 6 and a positive 6 cancel. 10 plus a negative 6 gives me a positive 4, and this is where we would drop down. Notice there's nothing to drop down, which means that this is my remainder. Okay, so notice this time my remainder is a positive, so up here I have to go put a plus. Remember, your remainder goes on top of the fraction, and this guy out front is what you put on the bottom of the fraction. All right, so my final answer is k minus 6 plus 4 over k minus 1. Beautiful. Okay, this one is a little bit weird. I have x squared minus 74 divided by x minus 8. So notice I go from x squareds to just a regular number, and I'm missing x's altogether. So whenever that happens, let's rewrite this as x squared. Since I'm missing x's, I'm going to put plus 0 x's. If you don't change it to this, where you're putting plus 0 x's, it won't work out for you. Okay, so now let's set this up neatly. And I'm dividing by x minus 8. And let's do that process. I need to figure out how many times will x go into x squared. So to figure that out, I take this guy, which is x squared, and I divide by the guy out front, which is x. I know x squared divided by x is x to the first, because 2 minus 1 is 1. All right, so x goes on top here. So next step is to multiply. So I'm going to take this x and multiply by both of these out front. So first, x times x is x squared. X times a negative 8 is a negative 8x. So for the subtraction step, what I do is I make all my signs opposite down here. This was a positive, so I give it a negative. That was a minus sign, so I turned it into a plus. A positive x squared and a negative x squared cancel. 0 plus 8 is going to give me my 8x's, and this is where we drop down. From here, we start the process all over again. I need to figure out how many times will x go into 8x. Well, to figure that out, I take this guy of 8x, and I divide by the guy out front, which is x. The x on top cancels the x on bottom, so that leaves me 8. It's a positive 8, so I'm going to go put that up here at the top. And now we multiply. I'm going to take my positive 8 and multiply by x. That's going to give me 8x. 8 times a negative 8 is a negative 64. So on to the subtraction step. So I take my bottom row and I make everything opposite. That was a positive 8x, so I give it a negative. That was a minus 64, so I change it to a plus 64. 8x minus 8x, opposites cancel. A negative 74 plus 64 is going to give me a negative 10. So from here we would drop down, but since there's nothing else to drop down, that means that this is my remainder. So because my remainder is a negative, I go up here and I put a minus sign. On the top I put my remainder. On the bottom I put what we were dividing by, so x minus 8. So my final answer was x plus 8 minus 10 over x minus 8. Okay, so let's set it up nice and neat. All right, so I need to figure out how many times n will go into n squared. So what I do is I take this n squared and I divide by the guy out front, which is an n. N squared divided by n is n to the first because 2 minus 1 is 1. All right, so this n is what I put up top. So I need to multiply. N times n is n squared. N times 5 is a positive 5n. All right, so for the subtraction step, I changed my signs to opposite. So this was a positive, so I give it a negative. This was a positive, so I give it a negative. A positive n squared and a negative n squared, opposites cancel. A 10 plus a negative 5 is going to give me 5, and those are my n's. Next step is we drop down that plus 18. We repeat the process all over again. So I need to figure out how many times will n go into 5n. So to figure that out, I take this guy of 5n, and I divide by that first guy out front, which is n. My n's cancel, so that gives me a positive 5. So at the top, I'm going to write plus 5. And now we multiply. 5 times n is 5n. 5 times 5 is a positive 25. And on to the subtraction step. So I make my signs opposite. I'm going to give this positive 5n a negative. I'm going to give this positive 25 a negative. Positive 5n and a negative 5n cancel. 18 plus a negative 25 is going to give me a negative 7. Because there is nothing to drop down, that means this is my remainder. So since my remainder is a negative, I have to go put a minus sign. My remainder goes on the top. What we divide by goes on the bottom. All right, so my final answer is n plus 5 minus 7 over n plus 5. Okay, last one. Notice that this one is a weird one because my x's are missing, so I'm going to have to rewrite it with 0 x's. So that's the same thing as saying 42x squared plus 0 x's minus 33 divided by 7x plus 7. All right, so I'm going to set this up nice and neat. So I need to figure out how many times 7x will go into 42x squared. So to figure that out, I take this guy of 42x squared, and I divide by the guy out front, which is 7x. Well, 42 divided by 7 is 6. X squared divided by x is x to the first because 2 minus 1 is 1. So that 6x goes at the top. And now we move on to multiplying. So I take 6x and I multiply by 7x. That gives me 42x squared Now I take this 6x and multiply by a negative 7. That's going to give me a negative 42x. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. What am I doing? This should be a plus right here. Y'all see that? I wrote that wrong. So let me erase this. We'll just restart because I goofed. All right, so on the multiply step, 6x times 7x, that gives me my 42x squared. But 6x times a positive 7 is a positive 42x. Sorry, guys. All right, so for my subtraction step, I changed my signs. This was a positive, so I give it a negative. This was a positive, so I give it a negative. A positive 42x squared, a negative 42x squared, opposites cancel. 0 plus a negative 42, that's going to give me a negative 42, and that was my x's. Next step is to drop down, so I drop down my minus 33. We start the process all over again, so now I'm trying to figure out how many times will 7x go into negative 42x. Well, to do that, I take this negative 42x, and I divide by the guy out front, which is 7x. My x on top cancels the x on bottom. Negative 42 divided by 7 is a negative 6, so that minus 6 is what goes on top. And we multiply. I take this negative 6 and multiply by 7x. That gives me a negative 42x. I take this negative 6 and multiply by 7. That gives me a negative 42. So for my subtraction step, I change the signs on the bottom. So this was a negative, so I change it to a positive. This was a minus, so I change it to a plus. A negative 42x, a positive 42x, opposites cancel. A negative 33 plus 42 is going to give me a positive 9. Since there is nothing else to drop down, I know that 9 is my remainder. So since 9 is a positive 9, at the top I have to put plus. 9 goes on the top of my fraction, and what we divide by goes on the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and write my final answer. And that's it. Bye, y'all.